means pot-bellied hill. The site ran for about 1,000 years, from 11,600 years ago to about 10,600 years ago. During that time, we see the fantastic elaboration of agriculture in Turkey. I asked Klaus Schmidt about that, and I said, do you think Gobekli Tepe had a part in that? He said, yes, absolutely. Gobekli Tepe was a center of innovation in some way. It was a place that people were called to, mobilized, and taught new stuff. The other thing he's telling me, pointing at the ground, is that what they've excavated is only a tiny portion of the whole site. They've been over the whole site with ground-penetrating radar, and at least 50 times as much still awaits excavation. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of giant megalithic pillars under the earth there. So goodness knows what else Gobekli Tepe has to teach us. But I don't believe for a moment that we're looking at a sudden, mysteriously precocious invention 7,000 years ahead of its time. I think what we're looking at is a transfer of technology. We're looking at the survivors of a lost civilization who already knew how to make megalithic architecture, who already understood agriculture, and who used this project to initiate the local population into their way of thinking. There are other Gobekli Tepe type sites. This one, Karahan Tepe, is about 50 kilometers away, hasn't even been excavated yet. You can see the T-shaped pillars sticking out of the ground in a farmer's backyard. We cannot separate Gobekli Tepe from the mystery of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia because between two rivers. Those rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and Gobekli Tepe lies right between the headwaters of those two rivers. So it's fascinating that Madeleine Danes recently found this piece from the Uruk V period of Sumer, where we actually do see a T-shaped pillar here, and another T-shaped pillar surrounded in a circle, and remnants of more on this broken side. Gobekli Tepe had been buried for thousands of years by 3,500 BC, but it suggests that something unknown was going on. There was some memory, some recollection of this time in the Sumerian period. And then, of course, from Sumer we have these bearded figures. Often they wear a fish on their heads. They're the figures who bring civilization to Mesopotamia. They're associated particularly with an entity called Oannes. He and the 7 sages, the 7 Apkallu, are the bringers of wisdom to Sumer. And they all carry, as I've 1,000 times pointed out, these cute little man bags, of which some 3-dimensional versions have survived. Why are they carrying these bags? What do these bags symbolize? And why do we find the same bag in the hands of a figure identifying with the civilizing hero of ancient Mexico, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the bringer of civilization to Mexico? This is the earliest image of the feathered serpent, and lo and behold, the same man bag is found in his hand on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And those man bags turn up at Gobekli Tepe on the top of Pillar 43. The same bags are found there. But there we know they're 11,600 years old. I think that we're looking at the symbol of, let's call it a brotherhood, some kind of initiatory group who went around the world and used this as their symbol and who brought the gifts of civilization, as is told in so many myths. I'm going to divert for a moment to the city of Harran. Well worth a visit if you're ever in that area. Harran is an ancient city. It's associated directly with the time of the Old Testament. It's mentioned in the Bible. Ur and Abraham are very much associated with that time, and there are the pools of Abraham that you can still find in Harran today. So it's thought to be about 4,000 years old or thereabouts. But Harran had a temple of the moon. And the people of Harran were called the Sabians, and they were renowned in the ancient world for their study of the stars and their worship of the stars. Now, interestingly enough, at the Temple of the Moon in Harran, the symbol has survived. It's the crescent disk of the moon, the crescent moon and the disk of the sun. And exactly the same symbol is found at Gobekli Tepe, the disk of the sun and the crescent moon. But Gobekli Tepe is thousands of years older than Harran. The Temple of the Moon is gone now. We're not looking at the Temple of the Moon here. This is an Islamic mosque that was built in Harran in the 13th century. It has also fallen away, but the single remaining minaret is to this day referred to as the astronomical tower. And it turns out that the people of Harran, the Sabians, made a pilgrimage to Giza in Egypt every year, and that this pilgrimage had gone on for thousands of years, and that it continued right through into the 13th century of our era. The Sabians of Harran practiced a religion that Islam regarded as pagan, but for a very long period they were allowed to continue with that religion. An exception was made for them for some reason that we don't fully understand. Eventually, of course, Islam fell upon them. But during this time, it's recorded that they made pilgrimages to Giza. And Salim Hassan speculates that these Sabians, if I guess rightly, had derived their name from the Egyptian word Sabah, star. Sabians were the followers of an ancient religion, worshippers of the hosts of heaven, the heavenly bodies. Whatever the origin of their name may have been, the fact remains that they fully recognized the pyramids as being monuments connected with the stellar cult. Now, if we go, there's Giza, and let's remind ourselves about the incredible precision of Giza, the placement of the pyramid on a non-random latitude, 30 degrees north, 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. It's almost perfect alignment to true north. It speaks to the earth in lots and lots of ways. The Great Pyramid that was the object of the Sabian pilgrimage. It is undoubtedly a mathematical scale model of a hemisphere of the earth. Robert has talked about this as well. Egyptologists know this, but they say it's a coincidence. It's one of those coincidence pigeons. It's a total coincidence that if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter and multiply it by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. It's incredibly precise for it to be a coincidence. And it turns out that the scale isn't random. The scale is meaningful. If the scale were 1 to 57,803, I wouldn't be so impressed. But the scale is 1 to 43,200, and 43,200 belongs to a sequence of numbers that are found in ancient myths and in architecture all around the world. And that sequence of numbers is thought to be generated by a key motion of the Earth itself, which I'm modeling with this GIF here. We all know we have a pole star. The pole star is the star that the extended north pole of the Earth points most directly at. And in our time, it's called Polaris. It hasn't always been Polaris because of this. At times, the extended north pole of the Earth has pointed at empty space. And at other times, it's pointed at different stars. Thuban in Draco, for example, not Polaris. The other effect of precession is witnessed on the horizon, and it concerns the background constellation against which the sun is seen to rise on the spring equinox. What constellation is lying on the horizon where the sun will rise due east on the spring equinox? In our time, it's the constellation of Pisces, has been for the last 2,000 plus years. Not an accident that the fish was the symbol of the early Christians. Constellation of Pisces, but we do live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And that is caused by precession. Gradually, the equinoctial sun is moving out of Pisces and moving into Aquarius. And the full movement will be complete within the next 100 years. Some people think we're already there. This process, whether it's at the pole or on the horizon, operates at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. 1 degree, that's a little movement. You hold up your finger to the horizon, that's 1 degree. That's what you need to observe in 72 years to understand this is happening. Obviously, to understand this process, you need to be passing down records for hundreds and hundreds of years. 1 degree every 72 years. 30 degrees, which is one house of the zodiac, in 2,160 years. That's 30 times 72. 360 degrees in 25,920 years. That is the great year. That's when everything comes back to where it started. That's the great return. That's the process of precession at work. And don't take my word for it. If you have the stamina, read Hamlet's Mill. by Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschen, both professors of the history of science. He was a professor of history of science at MIT. And what they've done in Hamlet's Bill, I won't bore you with the details, but they've massively documented ancient knowledge of precession of the equinoxes and an obsession with those numbers generated by the number 72, and just an absolute obsession with those numbers, which is found all around the world thousands of years before the Greek astronomers are supposed to have discovered precession. So you can find it in the Vedic texts, you can find it in the Norse myths, you can find it in the story of Osiris, captured by Seth and his 72 assistants. And what Santillana and von Deschen do is they trace the origin of the system to some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization of prehistoric antiquity that first dared to understand the world as created according to number, measure, and weight. And that's why this can't be an accident, because the Great Pyramid scale, the Pyramid-Earth ratio, is actually on a scale defined by a key motion of the Earth itself, by the precession. 72 times 600 gives you 43,200. So this is not a random scale, and this cannot be a coincidence. Santillana and von Deschen agree that the system is expressed not only in myth, but also in architecture. You find it all over the complex at Angkor, in Cambodia, by the way. And although I don't have time to go into it here, Angkor in Cambodia lies exactly 72 degrees of longitude east of Giza in Egypt. That number, again, if you take 72 and add to it half of 72, you get 108. Divide 108 by 2 and you get 54. These are all part of the sequence of numbers generated by precession, and you can see it in architecture at Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And you can also see it at the Hoover Dam. At the Hoover Dam, Oscar Hansen incorporated a star map into the architecture of the Hoover Dam, and he does so quite specifically so that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. In other words, he knew that in 10,000 years, nobody might be able to read the English language, or inscriptions might not even last in the English language. But if they understood astronomy and they confronted that monumental work of architecture, they could say when it was created because of this star map. And the suggestion is, of course, that that's exactly the same thing that's happening at Giza, that Giza is stamping a date on the Earth. The three great pyramids of Giza, and down here the great Sphinx, gazing perfectly due east across the Nile Valley. It's interesting how tiny the Sphinx seems in context of this overall image. And yet the Sphinx is 270 feet long and 70 feet high. But it almost vanishes in the picture here. And there's the Sphinx complex with its two megalithic temples in front of it. The Sphinx, of course, is cut out of solid bedrock. And when the bedrock was removed, it was moved over here, cut up into 100-ton blocks and erected as these two megalithic temples. So if by chance the Sphinx is older than Egyptologists believe, then these megalithic temples are also older than Egyptologists believe. And indeed, the geology, and here Professor Robert Schoch has just done incredible and amazing, important work. He was first brought to the site by John Anthony West, good friend of mine, rogue Egyptologist. John Anthony West was convinced that the Sphinx bore the marks of water erosion, and he wanted a geological opinion. And Schoch, when he came to the site and saw these distinct erosions in the trench around the Sphinx, it was immediately clear to him that the Sphinx had been exposed to about 1,000 years of heavy rainfall. And no such rains have fallen in Egypt in the last 4,500 years. You have to go back actually to the Younger Dryas to get the rains that could have eroded the Sphinx. Archaeologists at the time were furious. There was huge opposition to the Schoch and West idea. And their main argument was, no, it's impossible. The Sphinx couldn't have been made 12,000 years ago because there's no other monumental site anywhere in the world that is 12,000 years old. And if a culture was capable of creating the Sphinx, surely it would have created other sites. Well, of course, they could say that in 1992. But with the discovery of Gobekli Tepe, they can't say that today. Here we have a site of very similar age that's being proposed to the Sphinx on a very similar scale, and it's not even that far away from Egypt. So there's our Sphinx gazing perfectly due east. This is where you have to break the law. If you get up on the Sphinx's back illegally at the summer solstice, dawn on the summer solstice, you'll see the sun breaking the horizon over here. Dawn on the winter solstice, the sun breaks the horizon over here, far to the south of east. But you get up there at dawn on the spring equinox, the 21st of March, and you discover what the Sphinx is made for. The Sphinx is gazing directly at the rising sun, and the Sphinx's purpose is to marry heaven and earth on that special day, to lock it to that moment and that time frame. So the question is, what is the Sphinx looking at? It's looking at the rising sun, but what about the constellation behind the sun? If the Sphinx was made in 2500 BC, as we're told, it should have been made in the shape of a bull, because it was the constellation of Taurus that lay behind the sun during the Pyramid Age on the equinox. If your objective is to create a monument that's looking at itself in the sky, you want a bull there, not a lion. But there is a lion constellation. And lo and behold, if you go back, as you saw this morning, if you go back to 10,500 BC, if you go back to the time of the Younger Dryas, you find that the Sphinx is gazing at a lion-bodied constellation in the sky, a constellation that even looks a lot like the Sphinx.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Because I noticed that Leo is actually already over the horizon in this picture.
In this picture, this is an hour before dawn.
Oh, so it's not like a fixed place where it's rising.
Well, no, it's only going to rise there for 3 or 4 days. Then it's going to track away from due east.
So like when the sun comes up, it wouldn't be like perfectly, completely above
Here's
the horizon.
an hour before dawn. The constellation is still visible in the sky. Mm-hmm. You're looking at a lion on the ground, looking at a lion in the sky. An hour later, as the sun breaks the horizon, Leo is higher. But now our attention turns to the south and what's happening here at that very moment. I'll come to that. So it's interesting that 12,500 years ago, an equinoctial marker should have been carved in the form of a lion, and we have this lion equinoctial marker, which geology already suggests is possibly 12,500 years old. They're the Great Pyramids, this is the point now, that allow another hour to pass. Let the sun bisect the horizon. And what happens when you know your sky, it doesn't really matter if you can see the stars or not. Once you've worked it all out, as we can do with modern computers, you know what leads to the next thing. The rising of this means that will be there. And this is actually the fact that as the sun bisects the horizon, the constellation of Orion is lying exactly due south on the meridian. It's like the gears of a clock have clicked into place, and the constellation of Orion is in exactly the pattern of the pyramids on the ground, and that happens 12,500 years ago as well. So there's strong astronomy, both the Sphinx and the pyramids, that are speaking to the age of 12,500 years ago. Now let's return to the Sabians of Harran and their mysterious pilgrimage to Giza. The Sabians were renowned as geometers, as earth measurers, and as astronomers. And in these skills, they made particular use of right triangles. A right triangle is a 3, 4, 5 right triangle, has its sides in the dimensions 3, 4, and 5. It has a 90-degree angle here, which is the right angle. 36.87 is the acute angle, and 58.13 degrees is the other angle. That's true of all right triangles. So it's, again, let's remind ourselves about the precision, the measurement of the earth. It's intriguing when we go into the king's chamber in Giza that we find it contains a right triangle. I've shown in this diagram how it contains it. 15 cubits, 20 cubits, 25 cubits. It's a 3, 4, 5 right triangle in the heart of the king's chamber. And the most interesting thing of all, we have the Sabians making a pilgrimage from Harran to Giza every year, is that the city of Harran is situated on the Earth latitude 36.87 degrees. That just can't be a coincidence. Here is this city which is dedicated to measuring the Earth and studying the stars, which uses right triangles in trigonometry, and yet is situated on a latitude defined by the acute angle of a right triangle, 36.87 degrees north. That's where Harran sits. And even more puzzling, it turns out that there's exactly 1/1000th of the Earth's circumference latitude difference between Gobekli Tepe and Harran. And J.Q. Japers, the astronomer who discovered this, writes, even non-archaeos understand stratification and deposition basics. Deeper is older. Gobekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. Harran is equated with Ur of Sumeria, the civilized land and a cradle of civilization. That cradle and astronomy is presumed to be 4,000 to 5,000 years old, not 12,000. Harran is located at 3/4 Atan latitude, a fixed parameter, and Gobekli Tepe is at a specific latitude different north. Because the fixed parameter must come first, the conundrum, of course, is that this precise 1/1000th of the circumference latitude difference is either a coincidence or ancient astronomy just took a leap back to 12,000 years ago. And that's what I suggest it has done. Gobekli Tepe is requiring us to rethink everything. It's requiring us to rethink megalithic sites that are found all over the world. This one found at the bottom of the Sicily Channel has been covered by the sea for more than 9,000 years. We would not have been able to give it a context if it had not been for the prior discovery of Gobekli Tepe, because there weren't supposed to be any sites that old. The megaliths of Menorca are very similar in their T-shape to the megaliths of Gobekli Tepe. But archaeologists say Menorca is only 4,000 years old. And that raises the question of how do archaeologists date stone sites? And how they date them is always with organic material. You can't carbon date stone. You need organic material to produce your date. And you want that organic material to be in such an association with the stone that you can reasonably deduce that the stone was placed there at the age of the organic material. The problem is that the vast majority of megalithic sites on Earth, unless they're underwater, or unless they've been deliberately buried, like Gobekli Tepe, the vast majority of megalithic sites are open, and they have been used by later cultures. And I feel that the dating of the megalithic sites, because it fits with the prejudice of archaeology, what they've done is they've allowed falsely young dates from introduced carbon from later cultures to dominate the dating of these sites.
Graham, what do you think about Pumapunku and Tiwanaku and their structures and how the dating...
I'll come to Pumapunku actually, but I do believe Tiwanaku is a vastly older site, and less than 2% of Tiwanaku has been excavated. So the Maltese temples are also in question. In my book Underworld, published in 2002, I already make a strong case that they date back into the Ice Age. There's a huge amount of evidence for this, but with Gobekli Tepe now present, we must re-examine the whole story of Malta very, very carefully. I'm now going to take you to Baalbek in the Lebanon, and I'm sitting in the cella of the Temple of Jupiter. we're going to have a look at that site because Baalbek is often brought of mysterious ancient architecture, and I felt it was important, and there's suggestions that it was an ET landing site and all of that, so I felt it was important to go there despite the war in neighboring Syria, and to spend time on this amazing site of Baalbek in the Lebanon. So I'm sitting in what would have been the center, the cella of the Temple of Jupiter, undoubtedly a Roman temple, with another Roman temple dedicated to the god of wine, Bacchus, in the background. These are 6 columns out of 54 that once surrounded the whole temple complex that have remained. The rest have fallen down, and bits of the columns lie all over the place. This is a plan of Baalbek. That is the Temple of Jupiter. Those are the 6 columns I was sitting in front of. And on this plan, we see a mystery, because surrounding the Temple of Jupiter on 3 sides, like a letter U turned on its side, is a huge megalithic wall. But that megalithic wall is not part of the Temple of Jupiter. It is separate, quite separate from the Temple of Jupiter. So if we go back up to the Temple of Jupiter, we can say that there are no megaliths involved in the construction of the Temple of Jupiter itself. Excavations have revealed only small stones. But if we go up onto the north wall of the Temple of Jupiter and look over the side, we can see this enormous megalithic wall running along the north side of the temple, but separated from it by about 35 feet. And there again you can see no megaliths in the temple itself, but huge megaliths in this odd wall separated from the temple. The wall continues on the south side as well. It runs along this side of the Temple of Jupiter. Here we are again on the north side. There I am for scale. The biggest blocks are the 3 blocks of the trilithon in the west wall. These are the blocks that we hear about in all the ancient mystery discussions. You can just see the seam of the first one there, the next one, the third one. Each of these weighs 900 tons. They are raised up more than 20 feet above the ground. They are perfectly positioned. You can't get a piece of paper into the joints between them. And just again for scale, I'm pointing up at the trilithon here, and here I'm actually sitting on a bit of the trilithon. And archaeologists say that this dark block in front of my foot here, this is the reason why they can prove that not only the Temple of Jupiter, but also the megalithic wall were the work of the Romans. They excavated that block, and what they find it is a Roman column drum. It's definitely a Roman column drum. And it's in the foundations of the megalithic wall. Up above we have a Roman temple, so it seems reasonable to deduce that everything is Roman. But what is not at all being taken into account is the history of Baalbek in the last 1500 years. Baalbek was a fortress. It was implicated directly in the Crusades. It was attacked by Genghis Khan as well. The whole place was a turmoil for centuries. It was defended. It was used as a fortress. It was attacked with catapults firing huge boulders and demolishing bits of the walls. Teams were sent in to undermine the foundations so that the walls would fall down. And that's what I think this is. I think this is a repair block in an undermined foundation where the Arabs made use of some of the Roman bits of column that were lying around and used it as a repair block. And in fact, in a recognized Arab wall in Baalbek, we see a Roman column drum being used in exactly that way. And that's the Roman column drum in the foundations, and that's the Roman column drum in that wall. And I think it's pretty clear to me we're dealing with a repair block. The largest pieces at Baalbek are, of course, still in the quarry. This is the so-called stone of the pregnant woman. Oddly, it is separated from the bedrock by a clear division there. It weighs just over 1,000 tons, and you can get a sense of the scale of it from me in the picture there. On the other side of the road, now being used as a rubbish dump, unfortunately, is an even larger block. This one weighs 1,200 tons. And just in June of 2014, quite astonishingly, since the German Archaeological Institute had been excavating the site for 100 years, in June 2014 they found this block. Previously it had been covered by sediment. This block weighs 1,460 tons. And that's the front edge of it there, and I'm standing on it there. Now my view, very strongly, is that the Romans had nothing to do with this. The argument is that the Romans, having gone to the trouble of quarrying these blocks, of perfectly finishing them in every way, 3 of them at least, they discovered that they couldn't move them. So they just abandoned them and left them in the quarry. In my view, the Romans would not do that. They were very practical people. If they'd gone to all this trouble of quarrying these blocks, they would have sliced them up into smaller blocks, like loaves of bread, and they would have carted those smaller blocks off and used them in the construction of the temple. The fact that these finished blocks are still sitting in the quarry suggests to me very strongly the Romans had nothing to do with them. They didn't even know they were there. If they'd known they were there, they wouldn't be there anymore. They would have been cannibalized and used, but there they sit. So it suggests to me that we are dealing with a real mystery in the megaliths at Baalbek. And we find similar megaliths up in the Peruvian Andes. here at Ollantaytambo, this astonishing pink granite porphyry blocks in the range of 400 tons, brought 20 miles down a mountain, across a river, up to Ollantaytambo. It's really quite a stunning feat. And the architecture in the Andes, all of which archaeology gives to the Incas. Everything is made by the Incas, except for Tiwanaku. They accept that Tiwanaku wasn't made by the Incas. And they're supposed to have done everything in about 200 years. But the local people in that area maintain a tradition that the Incas had nothing to do with this giant megalithic architecture, that the Incas actually simply came and occupied much older sites and rebuilt and overbuilt around them. This level of precision with these jigsaw puzzle patterns is really quite stunning. You can barely see the joint between the blocks. And when we go to Saqsaywaman, above Cusco, these fantastic, huge megalithic series of walls, where school children are taught that they're entirely the work of the Incas. Let's look at these walls. There I am standing beside that stone for scale, 360 tons. The only record there is of the Incas attempting to bring a stone to Saqsaywaman ends in disaster. 3,000 Incas are attempting to emulate the great stones that they see there. And they bring a stone and they start to drag it across the mountains. It falls down the mountains. Hundreds of people are killed. They never succeed in getting it to the site. So I don't think the Incas built Saqsaywaman at all. And there's a suggestion that some kind of technology was used to soften the stone. So you get these curious indentations in the stone and the very molding together of these giant blocks. It looks more like sort of Play-Doh or putty than it makes sense if they could soften them. You get these curious indentations and patterns across all of the stones. Really, truly remarkable sight. So now we're in, who asked me about Tiwanaku? You did. Now we're in Tiwanaku. Arthur Poznansky, who did a huge study of Tiwanaku back in the early 1900s, was absolutely convinced that the site was at least 15,000 years old. He felt it was vastly, vastly ancient. But mainstream archaeology doesn't like that, and mainstream archaeology wants the site to be about 2,000 to 2,500 years old. And there are some carbon dates that support that, but are those carbon dates from the original Tiwanakans, or are they the result of later cultures occupying the site? That is not so clear. Again, the enormous scale of the architecture is obvious, and I'm intrigued by these H blocks at the back here. They do look prefabricated, as a matter of fact, but something else. The same icon is found at Gobekli Tepe. The same H-shaped pattern is found carved into the belts of these figures that we see in three-dimensional form in Gobekli Tepe. And the Kalasasea, this is the Kalasasea, this is the Akapana pyramid, this is the semi-subterranean temple. Let's take a closer look at the Kalasasea, and we discover that it is in fact a megalithic enclosure, that the heart of it is this row of megaliths that run all the way round. And if you go closer, you can see those megaliths more clearly. And it turns out that this wall between them is entirely a modern invention. It's been put there by archaeologists. It's not ancient at all. It's how archaeologists think the site should have looked. So it's a kind of Disney world that we're looking at here, not real Tiwanaku. This is real Tiwanaku. These megaliths that define the whole enclosure, that is real Tiwanaku.
Do you think they used them to measure the stars?
Well, there's an astronomical alignment which I'll come to, which is puzzling. It concerns the gateway of the sun, about which I could speak on its own for hours on end, and the way that it plays with the sun. But there's a very curious thing. It aligns to the summer solstice sunrise, but not quite. It's slightly off the perfect alignment. And the reason for that is that there's another motion of the Earth, as well as precession. The axis of the Earth changes its tilt through about 4 degrees over a period of tens of thousands of years. And when you do the calculations, you find that Kalasasea aligned perfectly to the summer solstice sunrise in the epoch of 10,000 BC, not in our epoch today. In that semi-subterranean temple that I showed you, there's a pillar. Carved into the side of the pillar is a serpent and another animal. You won't see it clearly, it's up at the top of the pillar there, but we've focused in on it here and turned it on its side, and that's what the animal looks like. We've outlined it here. It doesn't resemble any known species of animal in the Andes today, but it looks astonishingly like Toxodon. And Toxodon was one of those megafauna that went extinct during the Younger Dryas, 12,800 years ago. On the front of the figure is a human face. The human face is prominently and richly bearded with a sort of goatee beard. The Native American peoples of that region do not grow beards. It's a strange thing that the beard should be there. And he's associated with a bearded civilizing hero called Viracocha, who comes in a time of darkness after a great flood to bestow the gifts of civilization in the Andes. And the story goes that Viracocha's travels took him to Manta in Ecuador, from where he crossed the Pacific Ocean walking on water. And I just show this report from the 1960s. Columns, man-made columns, found at a depth of 6,000 feet beneath the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Ecuador. It's never been followed up. So we'll go to Easter Island and we'll look at the famous Moai. Read any archaeological textbook and you'll be told that the Moai are between 700 and 1,000 years old. That's what they date to. How do they know that? They know that from carbon dating, but as we know, you can't carbon date stone. So what have they done? They've carbon dated organic material taken out of this platform. And they've deduced that the platform must be the same age as the Moai, and therefore the organic material is a good guide to the age of the Moai. Yet even to the naked eye, it's obvious that this is not so, since there is an Easter Island head, an ancient Easter Island head that has been reused in the construction of this wall. That alone tells us the wall is younger than the Easter Island statues. How much younger? We cannot rely on carbon dates taken out of this wall to deduce the ages of these statues. But what we can do is look at sedimentation. This is the quarry. This is Rano Raraku, volcanic caldera. And in the heart of it, there are more than 200 Easter Island heads sticking up out of the quarry. And you would be forgiven for thinking that they're not deeply buried, maybe just a meter or so under the ground. But actually, Thor Heyerdahl's excavations in the 50s and again in the 80s revealed that these statues go more than 30 feet into the ground. They're covered up to their chests in sedimentation. And this is a real problem on a tiny island like Easter Island. How quickly would you get sedimentation of 30-foot depth? How long would it take for that to come down? The first person to notice this problem was Frank Joseph back in 2006. He really raised a question mark over this. It's very odd that there's so much sedimentation. It suggests strongly that these statues are extremely ancient. And Robert Schoch latterly has gone into this and looked at the sedimentation, and as a geologist, he's pretty confident that it would have taken several thousand years for that sedimentation to build up, not 700 years. I had the privilege of knowing Thor Heyerdahl, met him several times. I'm photographed with him here in Tenerife back in the year 2000. If Thor Heyerdahl had known about Gobekli Tepe, I think he would have been intrigued, because he already drew attention to the belts that the Easter Island figures wear and their curious hand position over the belly like that. So all of the Gobekli Tepe columns are anthropomorphic. They all have arms and hands and elbows. These T-shaped megaliths are meant to represent a human figure. And when we look at the arms, we can see that the hands meet across the belly, just like the hands of the Easter Island figure meet across the belly. And in both cases, there's this suggestion of a belt being involved. Moreover, the Easter Island figures are definitely bearded men. There's no doubt. You can see the beard quite clearly in some of the carvings. And we're told that 7 of them, 7 sages, brought the gifts of wisdom to Easter Island in remote prehistory after a great flood. Again, that 7 sages, that whether it's the 7 Apkallu, the magicians of the gods, whether it's the 7 rishis of India, whether it's the 7 sages of Easter Island, the story is found all around the world. And it reminds us of these other bearded civilizing heroes like Quetzalcoatl, like Osiris, like Oannes, all of them said to have brought the gifts of civilization after a great cataclysm. Now, historians and archaeologists continue to scoff at Atlantis and have not paid attention to the bizarre precision of meltwater pulse 1b and Plato's Atlantis date. And historians and archaeologists say they're completely satisfied with the timeline of history. That we have the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, and then we move into the first cities and the first civilizations and first... It's all clearly laid out. And there's no time, no place in there for a lost civilization of the Ice Age. But in this house of history, what archaeologists are failing to do, and after 10 years, they don't really have an excuse anymore. This information was new 10 years ago, but it's not new anymore. There is no dispute, whatever the agency, that the Younger Dryas was an absolutely horrific global cataclysm. And that's the problem, because the Younger Dryas cataclysm occurs between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, right in the foundations of the house of history. And we all know what happens when you build a house on foundations of sand. That house falls down. And I believe that that's what archaeology has done by ignoring the Younger Dryas mystery. They cannot tell us about the origins of civilization if they don't take that into account in their model. And up to now, they're not taking it into account because to do so would require a paradigm shift. And that brings us back to the paradigm shift of Clovis, and now we have to reimagine what the peopling of the New World looked like. If it wasn't Clovis, what was it? As a matter of fact, this is what my next book is going to be about. It's going to be about ancient America and what now appears to be 100,000 years of missing history that needs to be looked at very, very carefully. And there's the piece in Nature lamenting the persecution of those who opposed the Clovis model. And genetic evidence is being brought to bear. One of the curiosities is that a strong genetic signal links South American Indians with the Aborigines of Australia. Very, very strong and very, very clear. And this has, caught some press attention recently.
Could you say anything about the long heads, the Paracas heads, which are, as I just heard now, not only in South America, but they are found a little bit everywhere.
They're found everywhere. They've got about 20 of them in the vault of the National Museum of Malta in Valletta as well. Mm-hmm. We eventually managed to get them out.
You never see them.
Well, I saw them. I saw them in Malta and filmed them, as a matter of fact. I'm neither deeply intrigued by nor deeply attracted to that mystery. I've yet to see why I should believe it's anything other than head binding.
Because they are babies.
Well, that's what they do with babies. They bind their heads.
Yeah, but they are not yet fully.
I haven't seen a fetus skeleton with that. Anyway, it's an interesting matter, and it's just a matter that I've not pursued particularly, apart from in Malta. The genetics is being brought to bear. It's clear that we're missing a huge part of the human story in North America. And why shouldn't we be missing a huge part of the human story in North America when we now know that the whole story there was interrupted by the largest flood that ever took place on Earth, by a gigantic, absolutely humongous cataclysm? It's not surprising that archaeologists have found it difficult to find remains from before that time because they were all swept away. So I'll just move on now. The real possibility that emerges from the Comet Research Group's work, that a huge earth-shaking extinction-level event occurred over North America just 12,800 years ago in our historical backyard, helps to make sense of the chaos, confusion, and competing narratives and DNA mysteries that now dominate the debate around the peopling of the Americas. I would suggest that so much more than Clovis was wiped away and obliterated in North America during the Younger Dryas cataclysm. Who knows? Perhaps even we might find the fingerprints of a lost, advanced global civilization there. And just a reminder of what Plato said with the Atlantis disaster, that it wasn't the civilized people who lived in the cities who survived. It was the shepherds and the nomads and the hunter-gatherers who survived that disaster. And I'll close on this point about NASA's complacency and the notion that these events only occur every 100 million years. NASA will, if you read their literature, they will tell you we're in no danger from objects from outer space. But look at the fine print. What they say is, NASA says that all known potentially hazardous asteroids have less than a 0.01% chance of impacting the Earth in the next 100 years. That's very reassuring. We can relax. We don't need to worry. But the trouble is the word known. All known potentially hazardous asteroids. NASA can only report the number that it's spotted so far. But the problem is the unknown objects, and scientists estimate that so far only 1% have been found, with 99%, more than 100,000, still awaiting discovery. And I think we're facing wake-up calls from the universe. 2013, Chelyabinsk. Scientists revealed the full power of the Chelyabinsk meteor explosion. 2014, NASA on alert as huge asteroid set to skim past the Earth at 23,000 miles an hour. 2015, NASA just announced an unexpected asteroid flyby this Halloween. 2016, huge comet unexpectedly whizzes past the Earth. 2016, hours after discovery, asteroid swept by. 2016, an asteroid zipped through Earth's shadow last night. 2017, rerun asteroid buzzes Earth in second close shave of 2017. February 2017, NASA warns that asteroid larger than the Empire State Building could smash into the Earth. St. Patrick's Day, March 2017, watch as St. Patrick's Day asteroid comes dangerously close to Earth in extraordinary NASA video. Here's the BBC, April 2017, Gibraltar-sized space rock passes the Earth. We're in a cosmic shooting gallery, and these things are whizzing by us all the time, and very often we only discover them after they've gone past. Much more work needs to be done on this area. Scientists are increasingly aware of the danger. The focus, rightly and properly, is on the torrid meteor stream and on the huge objects that are circulating in the torrid meteor stream. Calculations by Emilio Spedicato, who is a mathematician at the University of Bergamo, suggest that in addition to the known torrid objects, Enki, Olgiato, Rudniki, all in the range of 2 to 5 kilometers in diameter. There are also between 1 and 200 asteroids of more than a kilometer in diameter orbiting within the torrid stream. And amongst them, their calculations suggest one extremely large dark object, about 30 kilometers in diameter. This is what happens to comets. They're visible when they outgas. They're very volatile. Their surface is bubbling with gases, and those gases create the visible effect of the comet. But comets also contain a lot of tar, and the tar will sometimes bubble up to the surface and completely coat the comet, and then the comet goes dormant. Some of these comets, like Rudniki, do that. They go dormant and then they light up again. And their calculations are that we've got a dormant 30-kilometer fragment of comet sitting in the torrid meteor stream. And that, again, is this issue of crossing an 8-lane interstate with a blindfold twice a year. But it really doesn't have to be gloom and doom. We absolutely, as a sophisticated technological civilization, we already have the technology to sweep our cosmic environment clean. All it would require is a grand human project. We'd all have to get together and pool our skills, and we'd have to stop throwing money at armies. We'd have to stop throwing the trillions of dollars inventing ever more sophisticated ways to murder one another. Instead, for the first time, we'd have to recognize our collective humanity and get together to make the Earth safe for our children and our children's children. And it can be done. The technology exists now. They're already looking at ways typical of our society. They're looking at ways of mining asteroids. What can we get out of them? Well, if we can mine the bloody things, we can move them as well. And the work has already been done. All it takes is money. And right now, that money is not being provided. So I will close on this point. By the way, this is your city. This is Hong Kong. And NASA photographs of the Earth from space are very beautiful. They call it the black marble. And we look down upon the Earth and we see the parts of the Earth that are lit up and glowing. And here we're focusing on Northern Europe. And we see how brightly lit Northern Europe is. Ironically, when you live in one of these cities, you can't see the stars. You can forget they exist because of light pollution. You just don't see any stars. But from the space looking down, you see the Earth lit up like a chain of jewels. But not all of the Earth. Yes, developed Europe is bright, but Africa's very dark. Down here in the Congo and in the Namibian desert, no lights at all. And this is normally taken as a sign of technological advancement. Our planet is beaming out to space, the bits of it that are technologically advanced, where everybody's got it good, and the bits of it that haven't yet been electrified and that are dark. And we kind of smugly regard ourselves as superior for being able to do this. It's true in all hemispheres. If we go to the Western Hemisphere, there's North America, gleaming like jewels, and there's the Amazon basin, almost completely dark. And in the Amazon basin, hunter-gatherer tribes who don't even know we exist. They may see an airplane from time to time, but they've not been contacted yet. We get some photographs of them like this. So the point I want to end on is this. If the Younger Dryas comet were to hit us again, if we were to face a cataclysm on the scale that the Earth faced 12,800 years ago, who would survive and who wouldn't? I don't think that our advanced technological civilization, human beings would certainly survive, but I don't think our advanced technological civilization would survive. This is a civilization that is built upon interdependency. Everybody has their specific skill and they don't know other skills. We all depend on each other in order to create this success story. Very few of us have any survival skills at all. We don't know how to hunt, we don't know how to fish, we don't know how to grow crops. We are completely ignorant in that area. And socially and psychologically, we are not prepared to have it all stripped away from us overnight. Yes, there would be survivors, but they would be incredibly demoralized. The food into cities is on a 3-day basis right now. Any city will starve if it doesn't get its food supply within 3 days. You can imagine the Walking Dead scenario breaking out relatively quickly across the industrialized world. But there are people who would make it through almost unscathed, and those are these people. Those are the hunter-gatherers. Those are the meek of the earth, whether in the Amazon jungle or in Namibia. These are people who are in the business of survival. And they survive incredibly well, and nobody can teach them anything about survival skills. If this cataclysm were to occur, it would be they and their descendants who would carry the human story. We and our descendants would be gone. And their descendants, 10,000 years from now, who's to say that they wouldn't be telling a story, a myth, perhaps the archaeologists of that time would say, a myth about how there was a time when there was a civilization on this planet that was so advanced they were almost gods. They could fly to the moon. They could speak to one another and see one another on opposite sides of the planet. Their achievements were incredible. But sadly, they became arrogant. They became cruel. They began to impose their will on other peoples around the world. They ceased to wear their prosperity with moderation, and the universe struck them down. So let's make sure we're not the next lost civilization. Thank you very much. I'm pretty wiped now. I'm going to be giving another talk tomorrow, and after that talk I would like to have an open discussion on all areas of interest.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Graham.